Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Doar, the president of AEI, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon for a very special book event. The Edward and Helen Hentz book events we've been having have all been good, but this is an especially good one. We are very honored to have a former congressman from Indiana, former governor of Indiana, and the 48th Vice President of the United States, Michael Pence. Vice President Pence, come on in. Thanks for being here. Now, your mic is there. The book is So Help Me God, and one of the things that I've noticed in reading it is that it's an unusually personal book for a book that's written by politicians. It's got a lot of faith and a lot of family in it. Why did you feel it was important to bring your family and your faith so predominantly into the book?
Well, thank you for a wonderful question, and, but I want to thank you. And join me in thanking Robert Doar and the whole team here at AEI for the role you play in the life of the nation. I'm so grateful to each one of you. I take credit for Ryan Streeter. He was actually my driver in one of my early failed campaigns, now that I remember it. But I know he's a great member of your team here.
That's right.
We just so appreciate the work of AEI, and it's an honor to be here. You know, when I was talking to publishers about 2 years ago after leaving the White House, I was in one conversation with Simon & Schuster that I would eventually sign with. And many of the companies that talked to me about doing a book were mostly interested in our White House years, and that was understandable. But I'll never forget, the publisher looked at me and said, "You know, we think you're kind of different." And I said, "Well, thanks." And they said, we think Indiana has a lot to do with that. We think your faith and your family, you know, have everything to do with kind of your approach to public life. And they said, the story we'd like to publish is your whole life story. And I'm grateful to Simon & Schuster for the opportunity to do that, because in so many ways, while I think the majority of the book is about our White House years and a record that I'm incredibly proud of, that rebuilt our military, revived our economy, appointed conservatives to our courts at every level, including 3 Supreme Court justices that I deeply admire. But before that, it is a story about growing up in a small town in Indiana, son of a combat veteran, and a first-generation Irish American. My grandfather immigrated to this country, came through Ellis Island, and how that upbringing shaped me, my worldview, my belief in this country and in the American dream. It's a story about how I made a decision to put my faith in Jesus Christ as a young man in college, and met the girl of my dreams, married her 37 years ago, and then had 3 incredible kids. And along the way, failed early in politics, but learned lessons and tried to put that upbringing and that faith and commitment to family all into effect in my years in the Congress and as governor and as vice president of the United States. And so for me, So Help Me God I hope it's a book about a story of just an average American who's had extraordinary opportunities but been sustained by a family, by an upbringing, and by faith every step of the way.
So I want to follow up a little bit on the family. I was telling you earlier that Audrey and Charlotte, your daughters, are major characters in the book, along with your wife, Karen. And it occurred to me as I read the chapters about January 6th and the period after the election, that you were saying subtly in the book that you would have let your daughters down had you not done the right thing. Is that how you felt? Did you feel not just that they were supporting you, but they were encouraging you to make a stand for the Constitution?
Well, I'm incredibly proud of my daughters, but don't leave out my son, who's a captain in the United States Marine Corps.
He wasn't as present, though. Audrey and Charlotte were there, and
They
seemed
were.
to me.
Yeah, Charlotte was literally, Karen and Charlotte were with me on January 6th at the Capitol. And they wouldn't leave. When I went home at 4 in the morning on January 7th, we rode home together. And they are incredible people. My daughter Audrey is a Yale Law graduate and remarkable young woman. But I actually write in So Help Me God about in the days leading up to that day in January, my family was all together. We'd taken time away over Christmas out west doing a little skiing. And I was sitting across the table from my son, who's been in the Marine Corps now for about 7 years. He's a pilot and a captain. And my son, unlike his father, is a man of few words. But he looked at me at one point and he said, "Dad, you took the same oath I took and nothing else matters." And it made me proud as a father that he said that to me.
So family.
But it was also an important moment for me. I mean, every member of the Armed Forces of the United States takes an oath very similar to the one that every member of Congress takes, presidents and vice presidents, governors around the country, and elected officials. That is simply to put your hand on a Bible, raise your right hand, and make a pledge to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And those members of our armed forces, of which one of my unworthy son-in-law is also a lieutenant in the United States Navy, they actually don't get to say that that's a hard assignment and I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Or they don't get to tell their commanding officer, you know what, I actually have a different opinion about whether we're going to take that hill. They're given their assignment and they go out with little regard for their personal safety. And we have men and women today all around the world who are keeping their oath. And by God's grace and the support of my family, we sought to do that on that fateful day.
So we're going to come back to that time a little bit at the end, but before I do, let me ask a question about our men and women in armed forces and the current conflict in Ukraine. If President Zelensky came to you and said, "Give me all the resources I need, not troops, but all the resources, equipment, so that I can take back Crimea for the people of Ukraine," what would you say if you were the President of the United States?
Well, I had the privilege of not just meeting, but becoming acquainted with President Zelensky. And we developed a very warm rapport. I remember, I write about in the book how after we'd spent some time together, we were at the UN months later and he cut all the way across the dining room so he could meet Karen and say hello.
Yeah.
And I must tell you, from the first time I met him, I sensed his quality. I didn't know what to expect. I thought a comedian, television star, becoming president. I didn't know what, but but I sensed his love for his country from the first time we sat down. I sensed his seriousness about leading his country, but I still marveled at his personal courage. One of my favorite quotes in a long time was when President Biden apparently offered to send a plane, and President Zelensky said, "We don't need a plane, we need ammunition." And
So you'd be very supportive, very supportive.
well, let me say, the United States of America is the leader of the free world. I've looked Vladimir Putin in the eye. I've stood closer to him than I am to you, and told him things that he didn't want to hear. Putin only understands power. And it's absolutely essential that the United States of America send an unambiguous message of support that our country and Western nations will stand with the people of Ukraine until Russia is defeated and their sovereignty is restored.
Okay, that's a solid answer. That's a straight. Let's talk about trade. Some people say, maybe even some scholars here at AAI, that the Trump administration went a little too far with protectionism. And I wondered how you felt about it from a standpoint of a conservative, I think traditionally a free trader. Do you think that you did, and what is your feeling for the Biden administration? Biden administration appears to be sort of staying the course with the Trump trade tariffs. Are you okay with that? Where are we? Where do you think world trade is now, and what's your view of that?
Well, I always had the view that trade means jobs, and it does. I've read enough of Adam Smith to understand the vitality and importance of trade to free market economics and the value of lower cost of goods for consumers that comes from it. And during my years in Congress, I always, as you said, Robert, I always supported free trade initiatives reflexively, including with regard to China. But I must tell you, after I became governor of Indiana, I began to see things differently. I saw communities around my state that had literally been hollowed out, factories being shuttered and moved south of the border. I also saw an increasingly aggressive pattern of trade abuses and ultimately military aggression by China. And so when I joined the national ticket, it was something Donald Trump and I first sat down and talked about. He was very aware of my record. And I heard him out. I believe that our administration changed the national consensus on China. I think the American people now understand that we can no longer tolerate the trade abuses and the military provocations of China, let alone human rights abuses against Muslim Uyghurs or Christians in their own country. And we need to send a strong message. But I think what surprised people, Robert, was that as our administration introduced the principles of fair trade that balance the interest of jobs and workers in our country, we then went on by the end of 2019 to enact the largest trade deal in American history, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. As I write in the book, I was very involved in selling that around the country. I traveled to a lot of districts, happened to be Democrat congressmen who were holdouts on the USMCA, and we were able to move that trade deal forward. And I think we show that you don't have to choose between being pro-free trade and being for the American worker. You can do both, and you can do both in a balanced way. And I believe the USMCA was a major improvement on NAFTA. I think it removed many of the, I must assume, unintended incentives to move jobs south of the border. And before we left office, we had already renegotiated the chorus agreement with South Korea. We were in preliminary negotiations for a free trade agreement with the UK. And even the EU had approached us about a free trade agreement. So I think changing the national consensus on China, standing strong on trade abuses with China as we did, that I'm pleased that the Biden administration is not undone. And what we were able to do to reform trade in North America were significant accomplishments, and I'm proud of it.
You were a very active vice president, very active, very substantive on all kinds of policy issues, and one in which you're most, because it was so much in people's minds during 2020 was COVID. And you write a lot about it in the book. And it seems to me that you are saying that a lot of the activities that were taken on by America to respond to the crisis, American manufacturers, American governors, American people in the federal government, your own team, was very successful in responding to the COVID crisis. Do you think now, looking back, that we got the balance right between economic shutdowns and protecting life and public health? Or do you have some regrets?
Well, I'll let history be the judge, and I'll live with it. But I will tell you, from the moment I was tapped to lead the White House Coronavirus Task Force at the end of February, what I tried to chronicle, particularly in the book, was those early days where we didn't know what we didn't know. We didn't know how serious this was. We actually didn't know how lethal it was. We didn't know how contagious it was. And the only thing we knew for sure is that we lacked testing of the magnitude that we would need to protect the country, that we lacked supplies, that there was a shortage of equipment like ventilators in America, that if what happened in northern Italy, if what happened in China was actually happening all across the United States of America, we would have lost lives of a magnitude and a scale unimaginable, simply because people would not have had access to the treatment that any one of us would want a family member to have. And the title of one of those chapters is Only in America, because I think one of the great stories is what the American people did in those early days of COVID, and we're prepared to put the interest of the nation first, and particularly free enterprise. I'm standing here at American Enterprise Institute. I think the response of our nation in COVID was an incredible affirmation of free enterprise. I'll never forget the day, one of our early briefings, after an early few weeks where there was not much politics being played, Democrats on Capitol Hill began to routinely bring up new issues the press would ask, and one of them was, why aren't you using the Defense Production Act? Right, fair question. The president was at the podium that day, and he got the question, why aren't you using the Defense Production Act? Democrats in Congress want to know. And the president answered, well, we're looking into it, we're this and that. And then as he and I were walking down the narrow hallway back to the Oval Office, he kind of punched me in the arm and said, how come we're not using the Defense Production Act? And I looked at him and I said, because nobody said no.
Yeah.
And he said, what? And I said, every company, large and small, that we called to do anything, dropped what they were doing and repurposed entire manufacturing lines to create the masks, the gowns, the rubber gloves, the ventilators that the American people would need. It was one of the most inspiring things I ever witnessed in my life. The companies that created out of whole cloth the testing, that literally tens of millions of tests became available to the American people in a matter of just a few short months. I mean, and then of course the incredible accomplishment that usually takes 5 to 7 years of creating a safe and effective vaccine within 9 months. It's all a tribute to American innovation, American free enterprise, but also the generosity of spirit in this country, where the American people just stepped up and didn't wait to be asked. And I also write about the unsung heroes, and I won't go on as long as I do in the book, but I encourage you to buy the book.
Yeah. You also talk
the
about the
unsung heroes include your grocery store operators. I end the one chapter with the story of a girl who grew up not far from right here. She had a debilitating genetic condition that made her immune system vulnerable. And she was a bagger at the grocery store. And her boss told her, you don't have to come in. And she told her parents, I gotta go. She said, my regular customers need me, because people are afraid. And she went, she got COVID. I actually met her parents at Arlington Cemetery when they were interring her remains there alongside her father. And there were legions of stories like that across America, where people set aside their own personal safety or concern and just looked after others, and we got through it. Are there lessons to be learned? You bet. And I think we ought to, before the next 100-year pandemic arrives, we ought to internalize the lessons from this one. But I'll always be proud of what the American people accomplished, particularly during those early days of the COVID pandemic.
In the book, you describe the growth of your relationship with former President Trump, getting to know him, getting the families to know him, the accomplishments of the administration, the things that you did to serve his administration, the hard jobs you took on. And then when the election occurred and he started asking of you things that you couldn't do, you had an exchange with him where you turned to him and directly said, this is in the book, no one has been more loyal to you in this administration than me. And I wondered whether you thought that loyalty had been returned to you by President Trump. And what's your view of loyalty from President Trump toward you, Attorney General Barr, toward many others? is he loyal to his team?
Well, I would leave that judgment to others. Everyone's entitled to their judgment of that. But I want to say, as I wrote in the book, President Trump wasn't just my president, he was my friend. We really developed a close working relationship, which I know surprises people. We're a little bit different. But from the very first time he interviewed me for the job, when at Bedminster in 2016, he used the word, Robert, that you just used early on. I asked him what the job description was for a vice president if he won the election. And he said, active.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean active? And he said, I mean, you know Congress, and you're governor, and you know foreign affairs, you're on the Foreign Relations Committee, so I want you to be active around the country, on Capitol Hill, around the world, and we were. And the trust that he placed in me, whether it was working to pass the tax cut, historic tax relief for the American people, rolling back regulation, advancing trade reform, negotiating a ceasefire with President Erdogan in Turkey, was very humbling to me, but it was a reflection of the relationship that we forged. And it isn't that we didn't have differences, and I recount a few of them in the book. But during the administration, I thought it was always important that I express my opinion to the president in private. And the relationship between the president and the vice president is very unique in all of the American government. And I never wanted to ever be in a position where there's any daylight between me and the president. Loyalty is the essence of a vice president's job. The only higher loyalty you have is to God and to the Constitution. And that's what set into motion, despite my efforts to communicate my position to the president for weeks before that fateful day, the confrontation that occurred between us and the mayhem that ensued that day.
Yeah, and it didn't just happen. You had made it clear all the way through, you and your staff, and they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't even. And then they issued that press release the night before, which said exactly the opposite of what you had told them.
Well, but I will tell you that during our 4 years serving together, I saw a number of occasions where the president, he had a penchant for taking a very strong stand on something, but I had seen moments where in quiet counsel he would eventually find a somewhat different place to be. And I'll never forget the night, not of January 5th, but of January 4th. Because as you said, I'd made it very clear to the president what I thought my obligation was under the Constitution. I mean, no vice president in American history had ever asserted unilateral authority to decide which electoral votes to count and which not to count. In fact, there's no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. The presidency belongs to the American people, and the American people alone. And I'd made that clear, and I'll never forget, I had done a rally in Georgia in the morning, and then in the evening I was watching his rally as I made a habit of doing. Throughout our 4 years, I'd catch a bit of what the president was saying out on the road. And he stood up and literally opened his rally by talking about me. And he told the crowd, our great vice president has got to come through for us. And the crowd cheered. And then he said, and if he doesn't, maybe I won't like him as much. But then he caught himself. And he looked at the crowd, shook his head, and said, no. There's one thing you know about Mike Pence is he'll always play it straight. And the crowd applauded, which blessed my heart. But I remember looking at the television, turning to my wife and saying, I think he's coming around. I think he's coming around to understand that whether he saw the constitutional provision the same way I did, that I was doing in my heart of hearts what I knew was right and what my oath of office required of me. But sadly, it was not to be.
So just turning a little bit from the book to news of the last couple days or today, the last couple weeks. How do you interpret the 2022 round of elections? The word around town is that it was a sign that the Republican Party has to get past Trump and start fresh. Do you see it that way?
I see it somewhat different. I mean, I campaigned in 35 states over the last 2 years, which is easier to do from Indiana than it is from out here. And I have to tell you that there was a red wave in lots of places around the country. I don't know if you noticed, Iowa now, every member of Congress in Iowa for the first time in 80 years is a Republican. We saw landslide victories in places like Georgia and Florida and Texas statewide. We elected 4 new members of Congress from New York. I mean, literally, the majority makers in the House of Representatives might be 4 new congressmen from New York. Kudos to my friend Lee Zeldin for running a brilliant and courageous campaign. The common denominator that I see, Robert, is that candidates that were focused on the future, on bringing proven conservative solutions to the challenges the American people are facing today, did well. Candidates that were focused on the past, particularly those that were focused on relitigating the past, did not do as well. And I think as you look in one race after another, that theme recurs. I said when I went in and campaigned for Governor Brian Kemp, who again, A, didn't need my help, B, has been a brilliant, successful conservative governor and ran an extraordinary campaign. But I was there the night before the primary, a primary that was largely being litigated on this question. I mean, his opponent, who's a man I respect and who served in the Senate when I was vice president, was running with the support of the former president on a look backwards. Governor Brian Kemp was running on his record, a strong, proven, conservative record on fiscal and social policies, on crime and on jobs. He won the primary by 50 points. But I said the night before the primary that the people of Georgia had an opportunity to send a deafening message across the country that the Republican Party is the party of the future, and they did. And then Brian Kemp defeated easily the most formidable Democrat opponent in the country by 7 points. Stacey Abrams raised $100 million, but again, by staying focused on the issues the people of Georgia cared about and focused on solutions for the future, he prevailed. So I don't think it's so much about personalities or any individual. It's about focus.
Okay.
And the future of the Republican Party is bright because I believe we will produce leaders at every level that are going to focus on those issues, bring real conservative solutions to those challenges, and lead America to a boundless future.
So we've got some people in the audience who have probably much better questions than I've had, and now it's time for some questions from the audience. Let's see if I got anyone right down here. Front, left, front, right.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. My question is, how would you explain to Americans and to Republican voters in particular the importance of American assistance to Ukraine? How do we communicate the stakes and make it seem a visceral issue for Americans as it is to many of the people on the front lines in Europe?
You know, I'm very proud of the foreign policy record of the Trump-Pence administration. And we stood with Israel as never before. We recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and it resulted in the first new peace agreement in the Middle East in 25 years. Another thing I'm proud of is that ours is the only administration in the 21st century where Russia did not attempt to redraw international lines by force. And I believe that was no accident. I believe it was because we made historic investments in our national defense, the largest increase in our national defense since the Reagan administration. And then, frankly, we allowed our military to prosecute America's interests in the world, whether it be cruise missiles into Syria when they used chemical weapons, whether it be a strike that took out the most dangerous terrorist in the world, Qasem Soleimani, or whether it be the historic accomplishment where the armed forces of the United States destroyed the ISIS caliphate, and took out their leader. These things left the world more secure and America more secure. And so now we live in a time after the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan where I believe the enemies of freedom around the world have been emboldened. I said many years ago, weakness arouses evil, but peace comes through strength. And we prove that in so many ways. And I think this is a moment of real testing for the United States and for the West. That the United States of America is the leader of the free world. And we are in this moment leading the free world, and the West is following to give the people of Ukraine the resources they need to defend themselves and defend their sovereignty, and so we must continue. But to answer your thoughtful question, I think we need to make two things clear, is the reality about Putin and the humanitarian cost on the ground. I've met Vladimir Putin. I've looked him in the eye. I've stood nose to nose with him. Putin only understands power. And anybody that thinks he's going to stop at Ukraine has, as we say in Indiana, another thing coming. I was sent in 2017, I was sent to Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. There were 120,000 Russian troops on the border in Eastern Europe at the time, just to fly the flag. Other members of the administration went as well, just to make it clear that our NATO allies in the region had our support. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, but it's a free nation. And if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, I have no doubt that he will continue to use force to try and redraw those international lines in places where we will have obligations for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, like my son and son-in-law. And so I think it's imperative that we stop him there. I remember the Reagan Doctrine, they used to call it. Mark Thiessen, who's a great member of the AEI team, said not long ago on television, the Reagan Doctrine always was, if you're willing to fight communists where you are, we'll give you what you need to fight them, so we don't have to fight them. And I think that's a common sense thought from Ronald Reagan, and one that we ought to bring into this moment, because that's who we're dealing with Putin. Secondly, the humanitarian cost. My wife Karen and I were traveling back from the Middle East in March, and we were invited to stop at a relief center sponsored by Samaritan's Purse, a wonderful Christian relief organization. They were operating on the border of Ukraine, just in Poland. We thought we'd just have a chance to go there and thank volunteers that were helping people fleeing the violence. And when we arrived, Edward Graham, Franklin Graham's son, a former Special Forces military guy, said, "We got permission from the Ukrainians for you and Mrs. Pence to go in, if you want to go." And we went in with a small motorcade, and we went to a relief center about 5 miles across the border. And I saw things that I thought I would never see in my lifetime. I'd seen them in black and white. Images of what was happening in Europe, fleeing from Nazi violence. But they're seeing lines and lines of women of every age, children of every age, carrying all of their earthly possessions on their backs, fleeing from the violence, and then speaking to them and hearing them talk about the abject desperation of not knowing if they would ever see their son, their husband, their brother ever again. That's what's happening. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an unconscionable act of violence, and it must be met with American strength leading the West to give Ukraine what they need, and are proving every day that if they have, they can defend their nation and they can defend their sovereignty. And I'm going to stand on that principle every day, including as we welcome a new Republican majority to Capitol Hill. I promise you.
Okay? I'm going to go right there and then to Ryan. Right in the back. Right there.
because Robert knows what I'm going to ask.
No, I don't.
Good to see you.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us at AEI, and congratulations on the great success of this book.
Thank you.
I noted that when you were recently talking about the success of the book, that you found it very encouraging about the possibility that it might lead you back into elective politics.
I'm not surprised that you noted that.
I did note that. I noted it with some interest. Democrats have undertaken a reformation of their nominating process for 2024 at the behest of the sitting president.
Right.
They've changed the order of states. Michigan goes to the fore. Iowa can shuck corn. Things are changing on the Democratic side. But in both parties, the kinds of nominating contests and the directions in which they go are changing. As you feel this encouragement and look ahead to 2024, what do you think the Republican Party ought to be thinking about as it thinks about how to choose its next nominee?
Yeah, I think, number one, it really is good to see you. Look, I don't think anyone could have defeated Hillary Clinton in 2016 other than Donald Trump. And I didn't learn that at the outset. As governor of Indiana, I endorsed another candidate in the Indiana primary, and in all fairness, Ted Cruz won all 3 counties I campaigned with him in. And Donald Trump won the other 89. But what I saw happen in Indiana just convinced me. I'll never forget. It was in that. It's actually in the book too. When we were, of course, I was being interviewed for the position. We were out at Bedminster, and we were, of course, playing golf. And at one point, we were on about the 17th hole. You'll like this. And the man I called Donald then turned to me and he said, "So what do you think is going to happen?" I thought he was talking about the game. I said, "I think we can get these guys because we're only a couple strokes back." And he looked at me and goes, "No, I'm not. I'm talking about the election." And I said, "I think you're going to be president of the United States of America." And he tapped the brake on the golf cart and he looked at me and said, "That's pretty definitive." And I said, "I think that's irrespective of who you choose to be your vice president." He said, "Okay. Why?" And I said, "I saw the connection that you made to people in my state. I mean, I know Indiana. I don't know everywhere. I know Indiana. And there were people I know that had never taken a Republican ballot in a primary who came out and voted Republican. And I think it was because in that moment, the American people knew that we needed a candidate who could meet the decades-long Clinton political operation with the same level of political strength. And they were right, and we won. And I have to tell you, you may remember, I never doubted we were going to win. But I think we're living in a different time now. I mean, I think the failures of the Biden administration at home and abroad have heightened a desire among people around the country to see us get back to what was working in the Trump-Pence years before that 100 years pandemic struck. I mean, everywhere I've gone in the last, and I don't travel with a big entourage anymore, but people spot me in the airport, they spot me at the Kroger, I drive my own car, I pump my own gas. And people come up and say, "Man, we got to get back to what you guys were doing," which was energy independence, which was 7 million jobs, which is wages rising, which is lowest unemployment ever recorded for African Americans, Hispanic Americans. It was a stronger military, America respected in the world, conservatives on the courts. But I think I also, in the same breath, almost invariably people say to me that they want leadership that has the potential of uniting our country around our highest ideals and solving some of these long-term problems. And I think that all begins with civility and respect. I think democracy depends on heavy doses of civility. And that wasn't always my opinion. If you read my book, I'd be honored if you did. In my early days in politics, I let my ambition overrun what I profess to believe in my Christian faith. You know, my faith teaches me to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. Politics often is do unto others before they do unto you. And I got caught up in that, and I ended up writing about it at the time. And in 10 years out of politics, I spent a lot of time thinking about how I would do it different. And by the time it came back around in my 40th year, we tried always to carry ourselves in such a way that made it possible for us to champion the conservative agenda without apology, but to do so with the kind of gentleness and respect that makes common ground possible. And I write in the book about friendships I enjoyed with the late Tom Lantos, the only Holocaust survivor ever to serve in Congress, or the late John Lewis, who actually asked me and my wife to lead the annual pilgrimage to the commemoration of Bloody Sunday. I didn't agree with either man on almost anything that I can think of, except that they were both good men and truly great men. And it was an honor to call them a friend. So I think that's what people are looking for now. I have a sense of that. We're going to sort out whether we have a role to play in that. For the Pence family, at least the last 20 years, it's always been about where we feel called. We'll spend some time over the holidays. We'll keep listening to Americans as we go into next year, and we'll make a decision. But I have great confidence that Republican voters are going to produce a standard bearer who will go back to championing all the things that we advanced, that we proved work for a stronger, more prosperous, more secure America, but do it in a way that makes it possible for us to solve some of the long-term intractable problems that this country is facing today under the failed policies of this administration, and frankly, problems that have lingered for decades and gone unresolved with reform.
So we'll turn to an old friend from Indiana that you mentioned him earlier, Ryan Streeter of AEI, for the last question. And then...
And Ryan, I'm not kidding, he was the driver on my campaign.
He's a lot more than the driver here, I'll tell you that.
I know he is. Yeah, you could have said he's still a driver, driving hard.
Yeah, that's true.
So my question
Incredibly
is,
proud.
Who was your favorite policy advisor when you were governor of Indiana? No. My real question, I wanted to ask you about immigration. It was seems like ancient history now that you invested a lot of personal time and spent some capital during the George W. Bush administration years trying to come up with a solution to bring people together on this very contentious issue.
Right.
And I'd like to hear whether or not you've updated your views since then. I know the border is first and foremost in everyone's mind right now for very clear reasons. But if we could wave a wand and the border security situation was where we wanted it to be in America, how do you see this immigration issue going forward? It's always been so contentious, and a lot of time's passed since you invested all that time. And I'm wondering if you've updated, changed, or maintained the same views.
Well, I think I have the same view, but as you said, I've tried to be a part of the solution over, now it's pushing 20 years. I believe, as Ronald Reagan said, a nation without borders is not a nation. I think our administration, by not only building a wall, but I, alongside Secretary of State Pompeo, negotiated the Remain-in-Mexico agreement, that the combination of those things reduced illegal immigration and asylum abuse by 90% in our first 3 years. And I think it created an opportunity, Ryan, for us to move on to major reform, to fixing a broken immigration system once and for all. And in fact, I can tell all of you that in the waning days of our administration, and there's a number of members who served the administration, around the administration who are here, we had on the drawing board a merit-based immigration system that we would have been working on in the first year of the second term. And that was an immigration system that essentially looked at what are the needs regionally and within various elements of the economy, and then looked around the world and said, how do we style an immigration system that says, we want men and women that can come into this country and meet those needs. Adam Smith said, no nation grows except by population. And immigration has always been a source of great American strength and prosperity. But we have a broken system now. The American people have lost faith in that system. And it demands reform. And I feel a particular compulsion about it, as I think I recount in the book. I was chairman of the House Conservative Caucus in 2006, and immigration was just as hot an issue then as it is now. And I had a woman by the name of Helen Kriebel, now passed away, who was a Colorado rancher, who came into my office. She said, I got this idea. She said, what if we had a plan to secure the border, have strong internal enforcement, but we created a guest worker program that was managed by private sector firms, like Monster.com and Kelly Services. And I remember what Phil Graham said one time. He said, there's no idea too big or too complex that it can't be fixed if somebody can make a buck fixing it, right? And it just resonated with me. At border security, internal enforcement, and then create a coherent system using the power of free enterprise to solve the problem and meet the guest worker needs that happen in our country, and then add the larger immigration reform to that. And I got involved in the issue, and at one point, I remember there was an editorial written that said, by Ruben Navarrete, who was syndicated at the time, but he said, you know, Pence is being equally attacked by the hard left and the hard right. He said, you know, when that happens, you might actually be onto something. And so President Bush asked for a meeting with me, you might remember. It's my only meeting in the Oval Office before Inauguration Day 2017. And I was as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, you know. You walk in that Oval Office, and there's a picture of me kind of looking kind of nervous. And I sat down on the couch, the gushy couch, and then the president's in his chair, and then Vice President Cheney and Karl Rove. And we talked for about an hour about the proposal. The president was looking for a solution. He said there has to be some rational middle ground between mass deportation and amnesty. And I think he was grateful we were trying to find it. But at the end of the meeting, he turned to me and he said, you mind if I ask you a personal question? And I said, it's your office. I mean, you can ask me whatever you want. He said, well, I noticed Indiana's not exactly a border state. And he said, you mind telling me why you got into this? And I said, well, probably April 1923 had a lot to do with it. He looked at me and he said, okay, I'll bite. And I said, well, April 1923 is the month that a young Irishman named Richard Michael Cawley stepped off a boat onto Ellis Island. And that's how Michael Richard Pence got to the Oval Office to meet the President of the United States. And he looked at me and he said, you get it, don't you? This is a nation of immigrants. And I said, Mr. President, I said, I don't just get it, I've lived it. And that Irishman's brogue still rings in my heart and in my memory. And I said, we owe it to him. And every generation has come before, the generations that are here today and the generations that are to come, to fix this broken immigration system. And I believe that we can do it. I believe if we return to the principles that did secure our border, that now has turned into the worst crisis at our border in the history of this country. It's total chaos. Border agents told me last time I was down there, cartels are in operational control of the American border. We secure that border. We have strong internal enforcement. We create a coherent immigration system based on the needs of the United States of America. It's like that old proverb about a tall wall with big door. That I believe that we can reform this system. But it's going to take the kind of leadership that could bring people together on our highest ideals. It's going to take leadership that speaks to the hearts of Americans. But I know we'll find it. I believe in the American people. My faith in them, my faith in God tells me that we'll solve these intractable problems. And And if the good Lord and the American people have any more use for the Pence family, we'll do our part.
Please join me in thanking the former Vice President, Mike Pence.